Track 2.
The First Epoch. 5. She has escaped from my asylum. I cannot say with truth that the terrible inference which those words suggested flashed upon me like a new revelation. Some of the strange questions put to me by the woman in white, after my ill-considered promise to leave her free to act as she pleased, had suggested the conclusion either that she was naturally flighty and unsettled, or that some recent shock of terror had disturbed the balance of her faculties. But the idea of absolute insanity, which we all associate with the very name of an asylum, had, I can honestly declare, never occurred to me in connection with her. I had seen nothing in her language or her actions to justify it at the time, and even with the new light thrown on her by the words which the stranger had addressed to the policeman, I could see nothing to justify it now. What had I done? Assisted the victim of the most horrible of all false imprisonments to escape, or cast loose on the wide world of London an unfortunate creature whose actions it was my duty and every man's duty mercifully to control? I turned, sick at heart, when the question occurred to me, and when I felt self-reproachfully that it was asked too late. In the disturbed state of my mind, it was useless to think of going to bed. When I at last got back to my chambers in Clement's Inn, before many hours elapsed, it would be necessary to start on my journey to Cumberland. I sat down and tried, first to sketch, then to read, but the woman in white got between me and my pencil, between me and my book. Had the forlorn creature come to any harm? That was my first thought, though I shrank selfishly from confronting it. Other thoughts followed, on which it was less harrowing to dwell. Where had she stopped the cab? What had become of her now? Had she been traced and captured by the men in the chaise? Or was she still capable of controlling her own actions, and were we two following our widely parted roads towards one point in the mysterious future, at which we were to meet once more? It was a relief, when the hour came, to lock my door, to bid farewell to London pursuits, London pupils, and London friends, and to be in movement again, towards new interests and a new life. Even the bustle and confusion at the railway terminus, so wearisome and bewildering at other times, roused me and did me good. My travelling instructions directed me to go to Carlisle, and then to diverge by a branch railway which ran in the direction of the coast. As a misfortune to begin with, our engine broke down between Lancaster and Carlisle. The delay occasioned by this accident caused me to be too late for the branch train, by which I was to have gone on immediately. I had to wait some hours, and when a later train finally deposited me at the nearest station to Limmeridge House, it was past 10, and the night was so dark that I could hardly see my way to the pony chaise which Mr. Fairlie had ordered to be waiting for me. The driver was evidently discomposed by the lateness of my arrival. He was in that state of highly respectful sulkiness which is peculiar to English servants. We drove away slowly through the darkness in perfect silence. The roads were bad, and the dense obscurity of the night increased the difficulty of getting over the ground quickly. It was, by my watch, nearly an hour and a half from the time of our leaving the station before I heard the sound of the sea in the distance and the crunch of our wheels on a smooth gravel drive. We had passed one gate before entering the drive, and we passed another before we drew up at the house. I was received by a solemn manservant out of livery, was informed that the family had retired for the night, and was then led to a large and lofty room where my supper was awaiting me, in a forlorn manner, at one extremity of a lonesome mahogany wilderness of a dining-table. I was too tired and out of spirits to eat or drink much, especially with the solemn servant waiting on me as elaborately as if a small dinner-party had arrived at the house instead of a solitary man. In a quarter of an hour I was ready to be taken up to my bedchamber. The solemn servant conducted me into a prettily furnished room and said, "Breakfast at 9 o'clock, sir," looked all around him to see that everything was in its proper place, and noiselessly withdrew. What should I see in my dreams tonight? I thought to myself as I put out the candle. The woman in white, or the unknown inhabitants of this Cumberland mansion? It was a strange sensation to be sleeping in the house like a friend of the family, and yet not to know one of the inmates, even by sight. 6. When I arose the next morning and drew my blind, the sea opened before me joyously under the broad August sunlight, and the distant coast of Scotland fringed the horizon with its lines of melting blue. The view was such a surprise and such a change to me after my weary London experience of brick and mortar landscape, that I seemed to burst into a new life and a new set of thoughts the moment I looked at it. A confused sensation of having suddenly lost my familiarity with the past, without acquiring any additional clearness of idea in reference to the present or the future, took possession of my mind. Circumstances that were but a few days old faded back in my memory as if they had happened months and months since. Pesca's quaint announcement of the means by which he had produced me my present employment, the farewell evening I had passed with my mother and sister, even my mysterious adventure on the way home from Hampstead, all had become like events which might have occurred in some former epoch of my existence. Although the woman in white was still in my mind, the image of her seemed to have grown dull and faint already. A little before 9 o'clock I descended to the ground floor of the house. The solemn manservant of the night before met me wandering along the passages, and compassionately showed me the way to the breakfast-room. My first glance around me, as the man opened the door, disclosed a well-furnished breakfast-table standing in the middle of a long room with many windows in it. I looked from the table to the window furthest from me, and saw a lady standing at it, with her back turned toward me. The instant my eyes rested on her, I was struck by the rare beauty of her form, and by the unaffected grace of her attitude. Her figure was tall, yet not too tall, comely and well developed, yet not fat. Her head set on her shoulders with an easy, pliant firmness. Her waist, perfection in the eyes of a man, for it occupied its natural place. It filled out its natural circle. It was visible and delightfully undeformed by stays. She had not heard my entrance into the room, and I allowed myself the luxury of admiring her for a few moments before I moved one of the chairs near me, as the least embarrassing means of attracting her attention. She turned towards me immediately. The easy elegance of every movement of her limbs and body, as soon as she began to advance from the far end of the room, set me in a flutter of expectation to see her face clearly. She left the window, and I said to myself, "The lady is dark." She moved forward a few steps, and I said to myself, "The lady is young." She approached nearer, and I said to myself, with a sense of surprise which words fail me to express, "The lady is ugly." Never was the old conventional maxim that nature cannot err more flatly contradicted. Never was the fair promise of a lovely figure more strangely and startlingly belied by the face and head that crowned it. The lady's complexion was almost swarthy, and dark down on her upper lip was almost a moustache. She had a large, firm, masculine mouth and jaw, prominent, piercing, resolute brown eyes, and thick, coal-black hair growing unusually low down on her forehead. Her expression, bright, frank, and intelligent, appealed, while she was silent, to be altogether wanting in those feminine attractions of gentleness and pliability, without which the beauty of the handsomest woman alive is beauty incomplete. To see such a face as this, set on shoulders that a sculptor would have longed to model, to be charmed by the modest graces of action through which the symmetrical limbs betrayed their beauty when they moved, and then to be almost repelled by the masculine form and masculine look of the features in which the perfectly shaped figure ended, was to feel a sensation oddly akin to the helpless discomfort familiar to us all in sleep, when we recognize yet cannot reconcile the anomalies and contradictions of a dream. "Mr. Hartright?" said the lady, interrogatively, her dark face lighting up with a smile, and softening and growing womanly the moment she began to speak. "We resigned all hope of you last night, and went to bed as usual. Accept my apologies for our apparent want of attention, and allow me to introduce myself as one of your pupils. Shall we shake hands? I suppose we must come to it sooner or later, and why not sooner?" These odd words of welcome were spoken in a clear, ringing, pleasant voice. The offered hand, rather large but beautifully formed, was given to me with the easy, unaffected self-reliance of a highly bred woman. We sat down together at the breakfast table, in as cordial and customary a manner as if we had known each other for years, and had met at Limmeridge House to talk over old times by previous appointment. "I hope you come here good-humouredly determined to make the best of your position," continued the lady. "You will have to begin this morning by putting up with no other company at breakfast than mine. My sister is in her own room, nursing that essentially feminine malady, a slight headache, and her old governess, Mrs. Vasey, is charitably attending on her with restorative tea. My uncle, Mr. Fairlie, never joins us at any of our meals. He is an invalid, and keeps bachelor state in his own apartments. There's no one else in the house but me. 2 young ladies have been staying here, but they went away yesterday in despair, and no wonder. All through their visit, in consequence of Mr. Fairlie's invalid condition, we produced no such convenience in the house as a flirtable, danceable, small-talkable creature of the male sex, and the consequence was, we did nothing but quarrel, especially at dinner-time. How can you expect 4 women to dine together alone every day and not quarrel? We are such fools. We can't entertain each other at table. You see, I don't think much of my own sex, Mr. Hartright. Which will you have, tea or coffee? No woman does think much of her own sex, though few of them confess it as freely as I do. Dear me, you look puzzled. Why, are you wondering what you will have for breakfast, or are you surprised at my careless way of talking? In the first case, I advise you as a friend to have nothing to do with that cold ham at your elbow, and to wait until the omelette comes in. In the second case, I will give you some tea to compose your spirits, and do all a woman can, which is very little, by the by, to hold my tongue." She handed me my cup of tea, laughing gaily. Her light flow of talk and her lively familiarity of manner with a total stranger were accompanied by an unaffected naturalness and an easy inborn confidence in herself and her position, which would have secured her the respect of the most audacious man breathing. While it was impossible to be formal and reserved in her company, it was more than impossible to take the faintest vestige of a liberty with her, even in thought. I felt this instinctively, even while I caught the infection of her own bright gaiety of spirits, even while I did my best to answer her in her own frank, lively way. "Yes, yes," she said, when I had suggested the only explanation I could offer to account for my perplexed looks. "I understand you're such a perfect stranger in the house that you're puzzled by my familiar references to the worthy inhabitants. Natural enough. I ought to have thought of it before. At any rate, I can set it right now. Suppose I begin with myself, so as to get done with that part of the subject as soon as possible. My name is Marian Halcombe, and I am as inaccurate as women usually are in calling Mr. Fairlie my uncle and Miss Fairlie my sister. My mother was twice married. The first time to Mr. Halcombe, my father, the second time to Mr. Fairlie, my half-sister's father. Except that we're both orphans, we are in every respect as unlike each other as possible. My father was a poor man, and Miss Fairlie's father was a rich man. I have got nothing, and she has a fortune. I am dark and ugly, and she is fair and pretty. Everybody thinks me crabbed and odd, with perfect justice, and everybody thinks her sweet-tempered and charming, with more justice still. In short, she is an angel, and I am— Try some of that marmalade, Mr. Hartright, and finish the sentence. In the name of female propriety, for yourself. What am I to tell you about Mr. Fairlie? Upon my honour, I hardly know. He is sure to send for you after breakfast, and you can study him for yourself. In the meantime, may I inform you, first, that he is the late Mr. Fairlie's younger brother; secondly, that he is a single man; and thirdly, that he is Miss Fairlie's guardian. I won't live without her, and she can't live without me, and that is how I come to be at Limmeridge House. My sister and I are honestly fond of each other, which, you will say, is perfectly unaccountable under the circumstances, and I quite agree with you, but so it is. You must please both of us, Mr. Hartright, or please neither of us. And what is still more trying, you will be thrown entirely upon our society. Mrs. Vasey is an excellent person, who possesses all the cardinal virtues, and counts for nothing. Mr. Fairlie is too great an invalid to be a companion for anybody. I don't know what is the matter with him, and the doctors don't know what is the matter with him, and he doesn't know himself what is the matter with him. We all say it's on the nerves, and we none of us know what we mean when we say it. However, I advise you to humour his little peculiarities when you see him to-day. Admire his collection of coins, prints, and water-colour drawings, and you will win his heart. Upon my word, if you can be contented with a quiet country life, I don't see why you should not get on very well here. From breakfast to lunch, Mr. Fairlie's drawings will occupy you. After lunch, Miss Fairlie and I shoulder our sketch-books and go out to misrepresent nature under your directions. Drawing is her favourite whim, mind, not mine. Women can't draw. Their minds are too flighty. Their eyes are too inattentive. No matter. My sister likes it. And so I waste paint and spoil paper for her sake, as composedly as any woman in England. As for the evenings, I think we can help you through them. Miss Fairlie plays delightfully. For my own poor part, I don't know one note of music from the other. But I can match you at chess, backgammon, escarte, and with the inevitable female drawbacks, even at billiards as well. What do you think of the programme? Can you reconcile yourself to our quiet, regular life? Or do you mean to be restless and secretly thirst for change and adventure in the humdrum atmosphere of Limmeridge House? She had run on thus far in her graceful, bantering way, with no other interruptions on my part than the unimportant replies which politeness required of me. The turn of the expression, however, in her last question, or rather the one chance word adventure, lightly as it fell from her lips, recalled my thoughts to my meeting with the woman in white, and urged me to discover the connection which the stranger's own reference to Mrs. Fairlie informed me must once have existed between the nameless fugitive from the asylum and the former mistress of Limmeridge House. Even if I were the most restless of mankind, I said, I should be in no danger of thirsting after adventures for some time to come. The very night before I arrived at this house, I met with an adventure. And the wonder and excitement of it, I can assure you, Miss Halcombe, will last me for the whole term of my stay in Cumberland, if not for a much longer period. You don't say so, Mr. Hartright. May I hear it? You have a claim to hear it. The chief person in the adventure was a total stranger to me, but may perhaps be a total stranger to you. But she certainly mentioned the name of the late Mrs. Fairlie, in terms of the sincerest gratitude and regard. Mentioned my mother's name? You interest me indescribably. Pray go on. I at once related the circumstances under which I had met the woman in white, exactly as they had occurred, and I repeated what she had said to me about Mrs. Fairlie and Limmeridge House, word for word. Miss Halcombe's bright, resolute eyes looked eagerly into mine, from the beginning of the narrative to the end. Her face expressed vivid interest and astonishment, but nothing more. She was evidently as far from knowing any clue to the mystery as I was myself. "Are you quite sure of those words referring to my mother?" she asked. "Quite sure," I replied. "Whoever she may be, the woman was once at school in the village of Limmeridge, was treated with especial kindness by Mrs. Fairlie, and in grateful remembrance of that kindness feels an affectionate interest in all surviving members of the family. She knew that Mrs. Fairlie and her husband were both dead, and spoke of Miss Fairlie as if they had known each other when they were children. You said, I think, that she denied belonging to this place?" "Yes, she told me she came from Hampshire." "And you entirely failed to find out her name?" "Entirely." "Very strange. I think it quite justified Mr. Hartright in giving the poor creature her liberty, for she seems to have done nothing in your presence to show herself unfit to enjoy it. But I wish you'd been a little more resolute in finding out her name. We must really clear up this mystery in some way. You'd better not speak of it yet to Mr. Fairlie or to my sister. They are both of them, I'm certain, quite as ignorant of who the woman is, or of what her past history in connection with us can be, as I am myself. But they are also, in widely different ways, rather nervous and sensitive, and you'd only fidget one and alarm the other to no purpose. As for myself, I am all aflame with curiosity, and I devote my whole energies to the business of discovery from this moment. When my mother came here after her second marriage, she certainly established the village school just as it exists at the present time. But the old teachers are all dead or gone elsewhere, and no enlightenment is to be hoped for from that quarter. The only other alternative I can think of—" At this point we were interrupted by the entrance of a servant, with a message from Mr. Fairlie, intimating that he would be glad to see me as soon as I had done breakfast. "Wait in the hall," said Miss Holcombe, answering the servant for me in her quick, ready way. "Mr. Hartright will come out directly. I was about to say," she went on, addressing me again, "that my sister and I have a large collection of my mother's letters, addressed to my father and to hers. In the absence of any other means of getting information, I'll pass the morning in looking over my mother's correspondence with Mr. Fairlie. He was fond of London and was constantly away from his country home, and she was accustomed at such times to write and report to him how things went on at Limmeridge. Her letters are full of references to the school in which she took so strong an interest, and I think it more than likely that I may have discovered something when we meet again. The luncheon hour is 2, Mr. Hartright. I shall have the pleasure of introducing you to my sister at that time, and we will occupy the afternoon in driving round the neighbourhood and showing you all our pet points of view. Till 2 o'clock, then. Farewell." She nodded to me with the lively grace, the delightful refinement of familiarity which characterized all that she did and all that she said, and disappeared by a door at the lower end of the room. As soon as she had left me, I turned my steps towards the hall, followed the servant, on my way for the first time to the presence of Mr. Fairlie. 7. My conductor led me upstairs into a passage which took us back to the bedchamber in which I had slept during the past night, and opening the door next to it, begged me to look in. "I have my master's orders to show you your own sitting-room, sir," said the man, "and to inquire if you approve of the situation and the light." I must have been hard to please indeed if I had not approved of the room, and of everything about it. The bow window looked out on the same lovely view which I had admired in the morning from my bedroom. The furniture was the perfection of luxury and beauty. The table in the centre was bright with gaily bound books, elegant conveniences for writing, and beautiful flowers. The second table near the window was covered with all the necessary materials for mounting water-colour drawings, and had a little easel attached to it, which I could expand or fold up at will. The walls were hung with gaily tinted chintz, and the floor was spread with Indian matting in maize colour and red. It was the prettiest and most luxurious little sitting-room I had ever seen, and I admired it with the warmest enthusiasm. The servant was far too highly trained to betray the slightest satisfaction. He bowed with icy deference when my terms of eulogy were all exhausted, and silently opened the door for me to go out into the passage again. We turned a corner and entered the long second passage, ascended a short flight of stairs at the end, crossed a small circular upper hall, and stopped in front of a door covered with dark baize. The servant opened this door and led me a few yards to a second, opened that also, and disclosed 2 curtains of pale sea-green silk hanging before us, raised one of them noiselessly, softly uttered the words, "Mr. Hartright," and left me. I found myself in a large, lofty room with a magnificent carved ceiling, and with carpet all over the floor, so thick and soft that it felt like piles of velvet under my feet. One side of the room was occupied by a long bookcase of some rare inlaid wood that was quite new to me. It was not more than 6 feet high, and the top was adorned with statuettes in marble, ranged at regular distances one from the other. On the opposite side stood 2 antique cabinets, and between them and above them hung a picture of the Virgin and Child, protected by glass and bearing Raphael's name on the gilt tablet at the bottom of the frame. On my right hand and on my left, as I stood inside the door, were chiffonières and little stands in buhl and marqueterie, loaded with figures in Dresden china, with rare vases, ivory ornaments, and toys and curiosities that sparkled at all points with gold, silver, and precious stones. At the lower end of the room opposite to me, the windows were concealed, and the sunlight was tempered by large blinds of the same pale sea-green colour as the curtains over the door. The light thus produced was deliciously soft, mysterious, and subdued. It fell equally upon all the objects in the room, and it helped to intensify the deep silence and the air of profound seclusion that possessed the place, and it surrounded with an appropriate halo of repose the solitary figure of the master of the house, leaning back, listlessly composed, in a large easy chair with a reading easel fastened on one of its arms, and a little table on the other. If a man's personal appearance, when he is out of his dressing-room, and when he has passed 40, can be accepted as a safe guide to his time of life, which is more than doubtful, Mr. Fairlie's age when I saw him might have reasonably been computed as over 50 and under 60 years. His beardless face was thin, worn, and transparently pale, but not wrinkled. His nose was high and hooked. His eyes were of a dim greyish blue, large, prominent, and rather red around the rims of the eyelids. His hair was scanty, soft to look at, and of that light sandy colour which is the last to disclose its own changes towards grey. He was dressed in a dark frock-coat of some substance much thinner than cloth, and in waistcoat and trousers of spotless white. His feet were effeminately small, and were clad in buff-coloured silk stockings, and little womanish bronze leather slippers. 2 rings adorned his white, delicate hands, the value of which even my inexperienced observation detected to be all but priceless. Upon the whole, he had a frail, languidly fretful, over-refined look, something singularly and unpleasantly delicate in its association with a man, and at the same time something which could by no possibility have looked natural and appropriate if it had been transferred to the personal appearance of a woman. My morning's experience with Miss Halcombe had predisposed me to be pleased with everybody in the house, but my sympathies shut themselves up resolutely at the first sight of Mr. Fairlie. On approaching nearer to him, I discovered that he was not so entirely without occupation as I had first supposed. Placed amid the other rare and beautiful objects on a large round table near him was a dwarf cabinet in ebony and silver, containing coins of all shapes and sizes, set out in little drawers lined with dark purple velvet. One of these drawers lay on the small table attached to his chair, and near it were some tiny jeweller's brushes, a wash-leather stump, and a little bottle of liquid, all waiting to be used in various ways for the removal of any accidental impurities which might be discovered on the coins. His frail white fingers were listlessly toying with something which looked, to my uninstructed eyes, like a dirty pewter medal with ragged edges, when I advanced within a respectful distance of his chair and stopped to make my bow. "So glad to possess you at Limmeridge, Mr. Hartright," he said in a querulous, croaking voice, which combined in anything but an agreeable manner a discordantly high tone with a drowsily languid utterance. "Pray sit down, and don't trouble yourself to move the chair, please. In the wretched state of my nerves, movement of any kind is exquisitely painful to me. Have you seen your studio? Will it do?" "I've just come from seeing the room, Mr. Fairlie, and I assure you—" He stopped me in the middle of my sentence by closing his eyes and holding up one of his white hands imploringly. I paused in astonishment, and the croaking voice honoured me with this explanation. "Pray excuse me, and could you contrive to speak in a lower key? In the wretched state of my nerves, loud sound of any kind is indescribable torture to me. You will pardon an invalid. I only say to you that the lamentable state of my health obliges me to say to everybody. Yes. And you really like the room?" "I could wish for nothing prettier and nothing more comfortable," I answered, dropping my voice, and beginning to discover already that Mr. Fairlie's selfish affectation and Mr. Fairlie's wretched nerves meant one and the same thing. "So glad. You will find your position here, Mr. Hartright, properly recognized. There is none of the horrid English barbarity of feeling about the social position of an artist in this house. So much of my early life has been passed abroad that I have quite cast my insular skin in that respect. I wish I could say the same of the gentry, detestable word, but I suppose I must use it, of the gentry in the neighbourhood. They are sad Goths in art, Mr. Hartright, people, I do assure you, who would have opened their eyes in astonishment if they had seen Charles V pick up Titian's brush for him. Do you mind putting this tray of coins back in the cabinet, and giving me the next one to it? In the wretched state of my nerves, exertion of any kind is unspeakably disagreeable to me. Yes, thank you." As a practical commentary on the liberal social theory which he had just favoured me by illustrating, Mr. Fairlie's cool request rather amused me. I put back one drawer and gave him the other, with all possible politeness.
He began trifling with the new set of coins and the little brushes immediately, languidly looking at them and admiring them all the time he was speaking to me.
"A thousand thanks and a thousand excuses. Do you like coins?" "Yes. So glad we have another taste in common besides our taste for art. Now, about the pecuniary arrangements between us. Do tell me, are they satisfactory?"
"Most satisfactory, Mr. Fairlie."
"So glad. And what next? Ah, I remember. Yes. In reference to the consideration which you are good enough to accept for giving me the benefit of your accomplishment in art, my steward will wait on you at the end of the first week to ascertain your wishes. And what next? Curious, is it not? I had a great deal more to say, and I appear to have quite forgotten it. Do you mind touching the bell in that corner? Yes. Thank you."
I rang, and a new servant noiselessly made his appearance, a foreigner, with a set smile and perfectly brushed hair, a valet every inch of him.
"Louis," said Mr. Fairlie, dreamily dusting the tips of his fingers with one of the tiny brushes for the coins, "I made some entries in my tablette this morning. Find my tablette? 1,000 pardons, Mr. Hartright. I'm afraid to bore you."
As he wearily closed his eyes again before I could answer, and as he did most assuredly bore me, I sat silent and looked up at the Madonna and Child by Raphael. In the meantime, the valet left the room and returned shortly with a little ivory book. Mr. Fairlie, after first relieving himself by a gentle sigh, let the book drop open with one hand, and held up the tiny brush with the other, as a sign to the servant to wait for further orders.
"Yes, just so," said Mr. Fairlie, consulting the tablette. "Louis, take down that portfolio."
He pointed as he spoke to several portfolios placed near the window on mahogany stands.
No, not the one with the green back. That contains my Rembrandt etchings, Mr. Hartright. Do you like etchings?" "Yes." "So glad we have another taste in common. The portfolio with the red back, Louis. Don't drop it. You have no idea of the tortures I should suffer, Mr. Hartright, if Louis dropped that portfolio. Is it safe on the chair? Do you think it safe, Mr. Hartright? Yes? So glad. Will you oblige me by looking at the drawings, if you really think they're quite safe? Louis, go away. What an ass you are. Don't you see me holding the tablette? Do you suppose I want to hold them? Then why not relieve me of the tablette without being told? 1,000 pardons, Mr. Hartright. Servants are such asses, are they not? Do tell me, what do you think of the drawings? They have come from a sale in a shocking state. I thought they smelt of horrid dealers' and brokers' fingers when I opened them last. Can you undertake them?"
Although my nerves were not delicate enough to detect the odor of plebeian fingers which had offended Mr. Fairlie's nostrils, my taste was sufficiently educated to enable me to appreciate the value of the drawings while I turned them over. They were for the most part really fine specimens of English water-color art, and they had deserved much better treatment at the hands of their former possessor than they appeared to have received. "The drawings," I answered, "require careful straining and mounting, and in my opinion they are well worth—"
"I beg your pardon," interposed Mr. Fairlie. "Do you mind my closing my eyes while you speak? Even this light is too much for them. Yes?"
I was about to say that the drawings are well worth all the time and trouble. Mr. Fairlie suddenly opened his eyes again, rolled them with an expression of helpless alarm in the direction of the window.
"I entreat you to excuse me, Mr. Hartright," he said in a feeble flutter, "but surely I heard some horrid children in the garden. My private garden below."
"I can't say, Mr. Fairlie. I heard nothing myself."
"Oblige me. You have been so very good in honouring my poor nerves. Oblige me by lifting the corner of the blind. Don't let the sun in on me, Mr. Hartright. Have you got the blind up? Yes? Then will you be so very kind as to look into the garden and make quite sure?"
I complied with this new request. The garden was carefully walled in all around. Not a human creature, large or small, appeared in any part of the sacred seclusion. I reported that gratifying fact to Mr. Fairlie.
"1,000 thanks. My fancy, I suppose. There are no children, thank heaven, in the house, but the servants, persons born without nerves, will encourage the children from the village. Such brats! Oh, dear me, such brats! Shall I confess it, Mr. Hartright? I sadly want a reform in the construction of children. Nature's only idea seems to be to make them machines for the production of incessant noise. Surely our delightful Raffaello's conception is infinitely preferable." He pointed to the picture of the Madonna, the upper part of which represented the conventional cherubs of Italian art, celestially provided with sitting accommodation for their chins on balloons of buff-coloured cloud. "Quite a model family," said Mr. Fairlie, leering at the cherubs. "Such nice round faces, such nice soft wings, and nothing else. No dirty little legs to run about on, no noisy little lungs to scream with. How immeasurably superior to the existing construction. I will close my eyes again, if you will allow me. And you really can manage the drawings? So glad. Is there anything else to settle? If there is, I think I have forgotten it. Shall we ring for Louis again?"
Being by this time quite as anxious on my side as Mr. Fairlie evidently was on his to bring the interview to a speedy conclusion, I thought that I would try to render the summoning of the servant unnecessary by offering the requisite suggestion of my own responsibility. "The only point, Mr. Fairlie, that remains to be discussed," I said, "refers, I think, to the instruction in sketching which I am engaged to communicate to the two young ladies."
"Ah, just so. I wish I had felt strong enough to go into that part of the arrangement, but I don't. The ladies who profit by your kind services, Mr. Hartright, must settle and decide and so on for themselves. My niece is fond of your charming art. She knows just enough about it to be conscious of her own sad defects. Please take pains with her. Yes? Is there anything else? No? We quite understand each other, don't we? I have no right to detain you any longer from your delightful pursuit, have I? So pleasant to have settled everything. Just a sensible relief to have done business. Do you mind ringing for Louis to carry the portfolio to your own room?"
"I'll carry it there myself, Mr. Fairlie, if you'll allow me."
"Will you really? Are you strong enough? How nice to be so strong! Are you sure you won't drop it? So glad to possess you at Limmeridge, Mr. Hartright. I'm such a sufferer that I hardly dare hope to enjoy much of your society. Would you mind taking great pains not to let the doors bang? And do not drop the portfolio. Thank you. Gently with the curtains, please. The slightest noise from them goes through me like a knife. Yes. Good morning."
When the sea-green curtains were closed, and when the two baize doors were shut behind me, I stopped for a moment in the little circular hall beyond, and drew a long, luxurious breath of relief. It was like coming to the surface of the water after deep diving, to find myself once more on the outside of Mr. Fairlie's room. As soon as I was comfortably established for the morning in my pretty little studio, the first resolution at which I arrived was to turn my steps no more in the direction of the apartments occupied by the master of the house, except in the very improbable event of his honouring me with a special invitation to pay him another visit. Having settled this satisfactory plan of future conduct in reference to Mr. Fairlie, I soon recovered the serenity of temper of which my employer's haughty familiarity and impudent politeness had for the moment deprived me. The remaining hours of the morning passed away pleasantly enough in looking over the drawings, arranging them in sets, trimming their ragged edges, and accomplishing the other necessary preparations in anticipation of the business of mounting them. I ought, perhaps, to have made more progress than this, but as the luncheon time drew near, I grew restless and unsettled, and felt unable to fix my attention on work, even though that work was only of the humble manual kind. At 2 o'clock I descended again to the breakfast-room, a little anxiously. Expectations of some interest were connected with my approaching reappearance in that part of the house. My introduction to Miss Fairlie was now close at hand, and if Miss Halcombe's search through her mother's letters had produced the result which she anticipated, the time had come for clearing up the mystery of the woman in white.
End of Track 2. Track 3. The Woman in White. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Read by
Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org.
Track 3.
The First Epoch. 8. When I entered the room, I found Miss Halcombe and an elderly lady seated at the luncheon table. The elderly lady, when I was presented to her, proved to be Miss Fairlie's former governess, Mrs. Vasey, who had been briefly described to me by my lively companion at the breakfast table as possessed of all the cardinal virtues and counting for nothing. I can do little more than offer my humble testimony to the truthfulness of Miss Halcombe's sketch of the old lady's character. Mrs. Vasey looked the personification of human composure and female amiability. A calm enjoyment of a calm existence beamed in drowsy smiles on her plump, placid face. Some of us rush through life, and some of us saunter through life. Mrs. Vasey sat through life. Sat in the house early and late, sat in the garden, sat in unexpected window-seats in passages, sat on a camp stool when her friends tried to take her out walking, sat before she looked at anything, before she talked of anything, before she answered yes or no to the commonest question, always with the same serene smile on her lips, the same vacantly attentive turn of the head, the same snugly comfortable position of her hands and arms under every possible change of domestic circumstances, a mild, a compliant, an unutterably tranquil and harmless old lady, who never by any chance suggested the idea that she had been actually active since the hour of her birth. Nature has much to do in this world, and is engaged in generating such a vast variety of coexistent productions that she must surely be now and then too flurried and confused to distinguish between the different processes that she is carrying on at the same time. Starting from this point of view, it will always remain my private persuasion that Nature was absorbed in making cabbages when Mrs. Vasey was born, and that the good lady suffered the consequences of a vegetable preoccupation in the mind of the mother of us all. "Now, Mrs. Vasey," said Miss Halcombe, looking brighter, sharper, and readier than ever, by contrast with the undemonstrative old lady at her side. "What will you have? A cutlet?" Mrs. Vasey crossed her dimpled hands on the edge of the table, smiled placidly, and said, "Yes, dear." "What is that opposite Mr. Hartright? Boiled chicken, is it not? I thought you liked boiled chicken better than cutlet, Mrs. Vasey." Mrs. Vasey took her dimpled hands off the edge of the table and crossed them on her lap instead, nodded contemplatively at the boiled chicken, and said, "Yes, dear." "Well, but which will you have to-day? Shall Mr. Hartright give you some chicken, or shall I give you some cutlet?" Mrs. Vasey put one of her dimpled hands back again on the edge of the table, hesitated drowsily, and said, "Which you please, dear." "Mercy me, it's a question of your taste, my good lady, not for mine. Suppose you have a little of both. Suppose you begin with the chicken, because Mr. Hartright looks devoured by anxiety to carve for you." Mrs. Vasey put the other dimpled hand back on the edge of the table, brightened dimly one moment, went out again the next, bowed obediently, and said, "If you please, sir." Surely a mild, compliant, and unutterably tranquil and harmless old lady, but enough, perhaps, for the present, of Mrs. Vasey. All this time there were no signs of Miss Fairlie. We finished our luncheon, and still she never appeared. Miss Halcombe, whose quick eye nothing escaped, noticed the looks that I cast from time to time in the direction of the door. "I understand you, Mr. Hartright," she said. "You're wondering what's become of your other pupil. She's been downstairs and has got over her headache, but has not sufficiently recovered her appetite to join us at lunch. If you'll put yourself under my charge, I think I can undertake to find her somewhere in the garden." She took up a parasol lying on a chair near me, and led the way out by a long window at the bottom of the room, which opened on the lawn. It's almost unnecessary to say that we left Mrs. Vasey still seated at the table, with her dimpled hands still crossed on the edge of it, apparently settled in that position for the rest of the afternoon. As we crossed the lawn, Miss Halcombe looked at me significantly and shook her head. "That mysterious adventure of yours," she said, "still remains involved in its own appropriate midnight darkness. I've been all morning looking over my mother's letters, and have made no discoveries yet. However, don't despair, Mr. Hartright. This is a matter of curiosity, and you have got a woman for your ally. Under such conditions success is certain sooner or later. The letters are not exhausted. I have 3 packets still left, and you may confidently rely on my spending the whole evening over them." Here, then, was one of my anticipations of the morning still unfulfilled. I began to wonder next whether my introduction to Miss Fairlie would disappoint the expectations that I had been forming of her since breakfast time. "And how did you get on with Mr. Fairlie?" inquired Miss Halcombe, as we left the lawn and turned into a shrubbery. "Was he particularly nervous this morning? Never mind considering about your answer, Mr. Hartright. The mere fact of your being obliged to consider is enough for me. I see in your face that he was particularly nervous, and I am amiably unwilling to throw you into the same condition. I ask no more." We turned off into a winding path while she was speaking, and approached a pretty summer house built of wood in the form of a miniature Swiss chalet. The one room of the summer house, as we ascended the steps to the door, was occupied by a young lady. She was standing near a rustic table, looking out at the inland view of moor and hill presented by a gap in the trees, and absently turning over the leaves of a little sketch-book that lay at her side. This was Miss Fairlie. How can I describe her? How can I separate her from my own sensations, and from all that has happened in the later time? How can I see her again as she looked when my eyes first rested on her, as she should look now to the eyes that are about to see her in these pages? The water-colour drawing that I made of Laura Fairlie at an after period, in the place and the attitude in which I first saw her, lies on my desk as I write. I look at it, and there dawns upon me brightly, from the dark greenish-brown background of the summer-house, a light, youthful figure, clothed in a simple muslin dress, the pattern of it formed by broad alternate stripes of delicate blue and white. A scarf of the same material sits crisply and closely round her shoulders, and a little straw hat of a natural colour, plainly and sparingly trimmed with ribbon to match the gown, covers her head, and throws its soft pearly shadow over the upper part of her face. Her hair is of so faint and pale a brown, not flaxen, and yet almost as light, not golden, and yet almost as glossy, that it nearly melts here and there into the shadow of the hat. It is plainly parted and then drawn back over her ears, and the line of it ripples naturally as it crosses her forehead. The eyebrows are rather darker than the hair, and the eyes are of that soft, limpid turquoise blue, so often sung by poets, and so seldom seen in real life. Lovely eyes in colour, lovely eyes in form, large and tender and quietly thoughtful, but beautiful above all things in the clear truthfulness of the look that dwells in their inmost depths, and shines through all their changes of expression with the light of a purer and a better world. The charm, most gently and yet most distinctly expressed, which they shed over the whole face, so covers and transforms its little natural human blemishes elsewhere, that it is difficult to estimate the relative merits and defects of the other features. It's hard to see that the lower part of the face is too delicately refined away towards the chin to be in full and fair proportion with the upper part, that the nose, in escaping the aquiline bend, always hard and cruel in a woman, no matter how abstractedly perfect it may be, has erred a little in the other extreme, and has missed the ideal straightness of line, and that the sweet, sensitive lips are subject to a slight nervous contraction when she smiles, which draws them upwards a little at one corner towards the cheek. It might be possible to note these blemishes in another woman's face, but it is not easy to dwell on them in hers, so subtly are they connected with all that is individual and characteristic in her expression, and so closely does the expression depend for its full play and life with every other feature on the moving impulse of the eyes. Does my poor portrait of her, my fond, patient labour of long and happy days, show me these things? Ah, how few of them there are in the dim mechanical drawing, and how many in the mind with which I regard it! A fair, delicate girl, in a pretty light dress, trifling with the leaves of a sketch-book, while she looks up from it with truthful, innocent blue eyes. That's all the drawing can say. All, perhaps, that even the deeper reach of thought and pen can say in their language either. The woman who first gives life, light, and form to our shadowy conceptions of beauty fill a void in our spiritual nature that has remained unknown to us till she appeared. sympathies that lie too deep for words, too deep almost for thoughts, are touched at such times by other charms than those which the senses feel, and which the resource of expression can realize. The mystery which underlies the beauty of a woman is never raised above the reach of all expression until it has claimed kindred with the deeper mystery of our own souls. Then, and then only, has it passed beyond the narrow region on which light falls in this world, from the pencil and the pen. Think of her as you thought of the first woman who quickened the pulses within you that the rest of her sex had no art to stir. Let the kind, candid blue eyes meet yours, as they met mine, with the matchless look which we both remember so well. Let her voice speak the music that you once loved best, attuned as sweetly to your ear as to mine. Let her footstep as she comes and goes in these pages be like that other footstep to whose airy fall your own heart once beat time. Take her as the visionary nursling of your own fancy, and she will grow upon you all the more clearly as the living woman who dwells in mine. Among the sensations that crowded on me when my eyes first looked upon her, familiar sensations which we all know, which spring to life in most of our hearts, die away again in so many, and renew their bright existence in so few, there was one that troubled and perplexed me, one that seemed strangely inconsistent and unaccountably out of place in Miss Fairlie's presence. Mingling with the vivid impression produced by the charm of her fair face and head, her sweet expression, and her winning simplicity of manner, was another impression, which, in a shadowy way, suggested to me the idea of something wanting. At one time it seemed like something wanting in her, at another like something wanting in myself, which hindered me from understanding her as I ought. The impression was always strongest in the most contradictory manner when she looked at me, or, in other words, when I was most conscious of the harmony and charm of her face, and yet at the same time most troubled by the sense of incompleteness which it was impossible to discover. Something wanting, and where it was and what it was I could not say. The effect of this curious caprice of fancy, as I thought it then, was not of a nature to set me at my ease during the first interview with Miss Fairlie. The few kind words of welcome which she spoke found me hardly self-possessed enough to thank her in the customary phrases of reply. Observing my hesitation, and no doubt attributing it, naturally enough, to some momentary shyness on my part, Miss Halcombe took the business of talking, as easily and readily as usual, into her own hands. "Look there, Mr. Hartright," she said, pointing to the sketch-book on the table, and to the little delicate wandering hand that was still trifling with it. "Surely you will acknowledge that your model pupil is found at last. The moment she hears that you are in the house, she seizes her inestimable sketch-book, looks universal nature straight in the face, and longs to begin." Miss Fairlie laughed with a ready good humour, which broke out as brightly as if it had been part of the sunshine above us over her lovely face. "I must not take credit to myself where no credit is due," she said, her clear, truthful blue eyes looking alternately at Miss Holcombe and me. "Fond as I am of drawing, I was so conscious of my own ignorance that I am more afraid than anxious to begin. Now that you're here, Mr. Hartright, I find myself looking over my sketches as I used to look over my lessons when I was a little girl, when I was sadly afraid that I should turn out not fit to be heard." She made the confession very prettily and simply, and with quaint childish earnestness drew the sketch-book away close to her own side of the table. Miss Halcombe cut the knot of the little embarrassment forthwith in her resolute, downright way. "Good, bad, or indifferent," she said, "the pupil's sketches must pass through the fiery ordeal of the master's judgment, and there's an end of it. Suppose we take them with us in the carriage, Laura, and let Mr. Hartright see them for the first time under circumstances of perpetual jolting and interruption. If we can only confuse him all through the drive between nature as it is when he looks up at the view, and nature as it is not when he looks down again at our sketch-books, we shall drive him into the last desperate refuge of paying us compliments, and shall slip through his professional fingers with our pet feathers of vanity all unruffled." "I hope Mr. Hartright will pay me no compliments," said Miss Fairlie, as we all left the summer house. "May I venture to inquire why you express that hope?" I asked. "Because I shall believe all that you say to me," she answered simply. In those few words she unconsciously gave me the key to her whole character, to that generous trust in others which, in her nature, grew innocently out of the sense of her own truth. I only knew it intuitively then. I know it by experience now. We merely waited to rouse good Miss Vasey from the place which she still occupied at the deserted luncheon-table before we entered the open carriage for our promised drive. The old lady and Miss Halcombe occupied the back seat. Miss Fairlie and I sat together in front, with the sketch-book open between us, fairly exhibited at last to my professional eyes. All serious criticism of the drawings, even if I had been disposed to volunteer it, was rendered impossible by Miss Halcombe's lively resolution to see nothing but the ridiculous side of the fine arts, as practised by herself, her sister, and ladies in general. I can remember the conversation that passed far more easily than the sketches that I mechanically looked over. That part of the talk especially, in which Miss Fairlie took any share, is still as vividly impressed on my memory as if I had heard it only a few hours ago. Yes, let me acknowledge that this first day I let the charm of her presence lure me from the recollection of myself and my position. The most trifling of the questions that she put to me on the subject of using her pencil and mixing her colours, the slightest alterations of expression in the lovely eyes that looked into mine with such earnest desire to learn all that I could teach, and to discover all that I could show, attracted more of my attention than the finest view we passed through, or the grandest changes of light and shade as they flowed into each other over the waving moorland and level beach. At any time and under any circumstances of human interest, is it not strange to see how little real hold the objects of the natural world amid which we live can gain on our hearts and minds? We go to nature for comfort in trouble, and sympathy and joy only in books. Admiration of those beauties of the inanimate world which modern poetry so largely and so eloquently describes is not, even in the best of us, one of the original instincts of our nature. As children we none of us possess it. No uninstructed man or woman possesses it. Those whose lives are most exclusively passed amid the ever-changing wonders of sea and land are also those who are most universally insensible to every aspect of nature not directly associated with the human interest of their calling. Our capacity of appreciating the beauties of the earth we live on is, in truth, one of the civilized accomplishments which we all learn as an art. And more, that very capacity is rarely practised by any of us, except when our minds are most indolent and most unoccupied. How much share have the attractions of nature ever had in the pleasurable or painful interests and emotions of ourselves or our friends? What space do they ever occupy in the thousand little narratives of personal experience which pass every day by word of mouth from one of us to the other? All that our minds can compass, all that our hearts can learn, can be accomplished with equal certainty, equal profit, and equal satisfaction to ourselves in the poorest as in the richest prospect that the face of the earth can show.